We went back up and I said, there you go.
That Myron who comes likes to buy that big jar of those cheese things, they're balls, like they're little round balls. He likes to buy that, and you know, you can eat a whole bunch of them without having any calories.
Yeah.
The first time we spent
You know where we're going in October?
Oh, yeah?
Where?
We're going to the Booth
Marshall.
Brothers reunion.
I want to stop to give you a
Indiana.
ride,
Oh,
but I try you wouldn't ride.
that sounds like.
And it's Ronnie, all the three Booth brothers, Paul and Ross are gonna be there, and Buddy Mullins. And it's for 4 days, and it's a package.
Did Jim Brady join back up?
Yes.
And,
He's helping them out.
Okay. He'll probably be.
Well,
Yeah.
yes, he'll be there. He cut his schedule back, and Michael cut his schedule back. And when Michael has engagements, he and Buddy, Jim Brady joins them. And then when Jim Brady has his own engagements, once in a while, Michael will join his. And it says, Melissa Brady featuring Michael Booth, and he just kind of sings extra with him. But he's trying to, he says, Michael needed my help, and I wasn't, the way I could tell him no.
I don't think so. I don't know.
I think this is.
They're gonna do this for this year, and then by the end of the year, they figure they'll either know what's,
But I mean, you
where
can't.
the call's coming back, or what they need to do.
No?
I mean,
Well,
this
then
is
maybe
the
it is. Then maybe it is the walk-in.
That
Hey, we
bus-
saw your girlfriend walking to church tonight.
The fast one, isn't she?
Oh, man, she was picking them up, putting them down.
That Buddy Mullins is a good singer. He's got a really good ministry. He helps with, he has his own ministry. What is it he does? It's been in the family for a long time. And he's got a good voice.
I am trying to picture now, is he related to the late Rich Mullins?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes.
What, Rich Mullins?
I think I
I'm good. I think, how are you?
He sang with the, Gaither vocal band at one time.
Yeah.
Quite a few years ago. He was young then.
Yes, it is.
You got some new glasses?
We were all young.
No, we weren't. I was born.
You got some new glasses?
No, I've had these for probably.
Really? I just noticed the blue and.
You know, I wish they got blue on the front too. You can do this one on the side.
Oh, man, that's neat.
That's why you got it.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know what I thought.
It's nice to have that on.
Oh, that's just wonderful.
Yeah.
That's a miracle.
You're extremely good today.
Yeah,
I said, you could- what's the other guy saying?
when you hear, if you hear like things coming out, it's not words.
Sorry for all that dead time. Welcome to Ancient Church Times. We are going to begin by reviewing a little bit of the controversies over the views of grace, the salvation, how salvation comes about that we covered last week. Primarily the conflict between Augustine and Pelagius. And then we're going to move into controversy that occurs following another persecution, and then into what brought about the idea of monks and monasteries and all that. So let's pray together. Father, thank you that we can gather together like this and learn what has happened in the past. It's to enable us to more accurately discern the present. We pray that you would guide our thoughts and clear anything up that is not perfectly clear at this point. We pray especially that we might always go back to your word for understanding what it is that we should believe. And we ask these things in Jesus' name, amen. All right, here are the basic views of grace summarized. We have Pelagianism, Augustinianism are the two main opposites, the main points, and then semi-Pelagianism and semi-Augustinianism as indicated by the views of John Cassian and Senator Orange, as mediating positions. So based on what we discussed last week, do you have any questions either about what Augustine believed, what the Bible says, what Pelagius and semi-Pelagianism, what they believed? Anything that you want clarity concerning these issues?
Fits in nicely with this Galatians sermon.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if you teach Galatians, Romans, Ephesians, there's a lot of places you can fall in the New Testament that directly address the issues. And again, like I said last week, Pelagius wrote a commentary on the epistles of Paul, and you wonder how he did that and come up with the ideas that he did. All right, seeing no questions. I'm not sure if we talked about the death of Augustine last week or not, and unfortunately this slide is not clear. I remember he lived in Carthage, which is North Africa, and as he was dying, the Visigoths, I think it was, were attacking that area. The barbarians that had attacked much of the Roman Empire were also coming into his area. As he was dying, he had someone write on his walls all of the penitential psalms, that is, psalms that had to do with confession of sin. You wonder, that would seem kind of depressing, but he felt like he wanted to make sure that he had the proper attitude, I guess, before he went to meet the Lord, that he was in a proper, humble state. So that's what he was reading as he died. And he died right before the barbarians took over the city. We've looked at a number of different issues, and this diagram is great to help us distinguish between different ideas, or not great if you have trouble following arrows and stuff. So on the left-hand side is Christ sufficiently like us to redeem. That has to do with who Christ was in the incarnation. And Docetism says, no, he was not really enough like us because he was so much man, or he was not God at all. He just had the appearance, he had the appearance of man. He wasn't totally like man. I got that a little bit backwards. So let me restate that. Docetism said that he was not truly human. He just appeared to be human. And so he wasn't enough like us to redeem us. If you want to say yes to that, then the next question is Christ sufficiently unlike us to redeem? And Ebionitism says, no, he was not enough unlike us. In other words, he not enough God. He was all man. And he was just simply another lawgiver like Moses. The yes to that question comes through what we call theological orthodoxy, that he was fully God and fully man. And therefore he is able to redeem us. On the other side is humanity unable to redeem itself. And the no answer to that comes from Pelagianism. He says that humanity is able to redeem itself. So he says, no, humanity is not unable. Humanity is not unable to redeem itself. Any human can live a perfect life, etc. The yes to that takes us to the question, is humanity able to accept redemption? The no to that is Manichaeanism, which is more of a cosmic humanist kind of philosophy. The yes, humanity able to accept. I don't really like the way that question is worded, because it sounds like man has the ability to accept, which takes us back up to more of a semi-Pelagian or semi-Augustinianism. But man is able to accept redemption if God works within his heart to change his heart. Just a word about early medieval Christianity. We're kind of moving towards the early medieval period. Just want to take you in that direction. Let's not bother with that. Oops, how do I lose the screen where the stuff is saved?
Number one?
Yeah. And Leonard, what page are we on?
24, and about to get into the rise of monasticism.
Yes. Before that, there should be the Donatist controversy.
Yes.
All right. So there's some additional developments that occur during this time frame, and we're going to be looking. The Donatist controversy does occur in chronology, but it requires us to go back a little bit time-wise. But then we'll be looking at movements as a whole. Okay, so oops, no, what should be my first slide. Yeah. I thought I put. I wonder if I put the wrong one on there. Yeah, I think that was you. All early missions, right?
Yes, it's called early missions, yeah.
Happened to the one I made. Okay, scroll down, please. Sorry about that. Go to world history. Roman Empire. Christianity. Go back up a little bit.
Early missions copy.
320.
It's not that because you just accessed it today.
The early missions one?
Monasticism.
Oh, I didn't want missions yet. What am I thinking? Yeah, I want monasticism. Got ahead of myself.
Exactly.
Oh, my bad. I was looking at, well, both sorts of them. I was looking at missions at home before I came and had that on my mind. We really want monasticism. Fun for those of you watching at home, almost as much as those that are here.
Exactly.
Slideshow. Just sort of pull it out a little bit. And I can pull this, right?
Yes.
Does it seem like every time I attempt to do something, it goes awry? Computer-wise. All right, here we are. We have covered the ancient period of church history, or most of it. We're moving now kind of in between, partly ancient, moving towards the medieval period. If you like, we may go on into the medieval period to see what happened there. We move next to the Donatist controversy. The issues are these. During the worldwide persecution of 313, under Diocletian, Emperor Diocletian. You may remember his name from a long time ago. And he persecuted the church throughout the empire. One of the few worldwide persecutions. Most persecutions of the church in the first 3 centuries were local, here and there. This is maybe the only or one of the few that were worldwide. So the problem is some Christians gave up the sacred books. When asked, give up the books, we're going to burn them or die, and some of them gave up the books. And so should they be readmitted to the church? That should sound kind of familiar because that's the same thing that occurred earlier. Those that were against admitting them into the church were called Novatians. Here, it was a matter of any clergy who had caved into persecution. It was felt by Donatus and others were no longer fit to lead the church and were not able to administer sacraments. So if you were baptized by a guy who had given up the books, then your baptism was invalid, and your celebration of the Lord's table was invalid, and anybody that they ordained was invalid, and so it becomes a big problem, primarily in North Africa. So Donatism is a heresy which questions the effectiveness of sacrament administration in order for the sacrament to be valid. In other words, the priest must be completely pure and of moral character. The sacraments of outsiders are invalid. The church is, in this world, exclusive and pure, a lily among thorns. To suffer persecution is a hallmark of the true church. And these were sometimes called rigorists. You know, they were rigorous for the orthodoxy of the church, the purity of the church. And their viewpoint was that these priests, these clergy should have accepted martyrdom and not given up the books. If they gave them up, they should be excommunicated. Purity is characteristic of the church. Again, like the Novatians that we studied before. There were some moderates that said, well, discretion should be shown. So the description of the conflict comes about when in 311, a churchman named Donatus wanted to exclude Caecilian from his office as Bishop of Carthage because he had been consecrated by Felix, who had been a traitor during the Diocletian persecution. So, you know, it's kind of secondary separation here. Donatus argued that the failure to remain true during the persecution invalidated the power of Felix to ordain because he had thus committed an unpardonable sin. Donatus and his group elected Majorinus as bishop, and after the death of Majorinus, Donatus became bishop. When Constantine gave money for the African church, Constantine is the emperor, and under Constantine, the church became legal, and in fact, even supported the church. And so Constantine has sent money to the North African church, and the Donatists complained because they didn't get any of it. So that brings it to the attention of the emperor. Now, Augustine, this is still during when he was alive, wanted to mediate. And he had this to say: the distinguishing characteristic of the church is not holiness, but love and unity. So the Donatists were saying, you've got to be pure. And Augustine says, that's not going to happen. But we can be loving and we can be unified. And that's not happening when you are pointing the finger at those who had a failure. Augustine says the one church consists of wheat and tares, so let them stay. What's he saying there? What's he mean by that? You know the wheat and tares parable that Jesus told? What was the point there? What's Augustine's point?
False doctrine.
But he's not dealing with false doctrine here. What are the tares? In Jesus' story, what are the tares?
Bad people.
Or unbelievers. And so Jesus' point was, don't try to root out unbelievers from the church. Let the angels do that in the end, because sometimes tares look like wheat and wheat look like tares. And so Augustine says the church is going to have tares. It's going to have unbelievers in it. let them stay. Don't be so legalistic. Thirdly, he said the line of apostolic succession can identify the one true church. So we have a connection with the apostles on down through the ages. They can identify the one true church. And then lastly, he says no one is in the church unless one is in that body of apostolic succession. And if not in the true church, one is not saved. So those that were trying to separate into other churches over this issue, he's saying, look, you can't go start your own church. You know, there's one church, and that's the church that has had the truth passed on. And so we need to make sure that the true believers are in that church. All right, so he's trying to mediate here, and I think evidence some grace. The outcome is that synod was held at Rome and decided that the validity of a sacrament does not depend on the character of the one administering the sacrament. Hence, the Donatists had no right to any of the aid. You understand the point there? The sacrament doesn't depend on how good a person it is that's giving it. You know, your baptism doesn't depend on how pure the person was that was baptizing you. The Lord's Supper doesn't depend on how pure the person is that is administering it. And so they said those that are trying to separate and be the purists in this really have no part in the church. All right, let's see. Well, in 428, the Vandals, it was the Vandals that invaded North Africa. They destroyed the North African church, and the controversy died because there wasn't anybody left. The churches were gone as a result of the Vandal invasion. So that's one way to take care of an issue in God's providence. All right, next we come to the rise of monasticism, and this is where I wanted to make sure we got to tonight and talked about this. When you think of monasticism, and that's monks, monasteries are words you can think of. Their hermits, the beginning, and so we have different stages. We have the initial stage, and you can see the time frame there. The hermit stage, which is a person just living by themselves. The cloister stage, which is people getting together and living by themselves, only together. And then we have the multiple cloister stage, where we have orders, where you have a bunch of different groups of people living by themselves, but they're all connected to one another in some way. Okay, does that make sense? It kind of progresses that way. So we'll go through those stages. First of all, the causes of monasticism. First of all, the influence of Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. Remember those were dualistic. There's a dichotomy between matter and spirit. Matter is evil, spirit is good. And escape from materialism. That mindset led men to think they ought to get away from material things, the material world, and go off by themselves. This morning we talked about John the Baptist going off into the desert by himself, and how that was a place free of distractions and all that, but that wasn't a lifelong thing for him. That was just until his public ministry. These guys saw it as a life. Also, we have the biblical injunctions toward poverty and self-denial, and the idea of an escape from the difficulty of living godly in a fallen world. So these men saw these different commands in Scripture that they believed elevated the idea of poverty, self-denial. So what better way to do that than to go off in the wilderness by myself and live? And then thirdly, the psychological tendency to retreat from the disorder of society in the context of the decay of the Roman Empire. It was an escape from a chaotic world. So you can imagine, even in our country today, there are already those who have decided to forego society and go live in Montana or Wyoming or someplace and find a spot out there in the middle of nowhere and live. You've all heard of people like that. Maybe some of you have been tempted to do that yourselves, but you can understand the mindset of, I'm going to get away from all this chaos and just go live by myself and let them try to find me. All right, any comments about the causes leading up to, one more. Increasing secularization of the church. So not only was it an escape from a chaotic world, but it was escape from a church that had become largely secularized. In other words, a church that had become worldly. So escape from the world You know, sometimes you think, well, I'll put myself into the church. Well, the church wasn't any better. You know, it become very worldly. And so it's, what alternative do I have? I'm just going to go live by myself. All right. Any comments or questions? Okay, let's look at the development of monasticism. First is the unorganized stage. And this might be called half in, half out. This was as early as the 2nd century, where some guys were half hermit and half clergyman. You know, sometimes they were out by themselves, sometimes they came back and were pastoring churches and going back and forth. So it wasn't like a lifetime thing. They just thought they should maybe live that way for a while. And remember, John Chrysostom, we talked about, had been living as a hermit, and they called him to become pastor. The church kind of forced him to do that, and became the Bishop of Constantinople. So that's the unorganized stage. Next is the hermit stage, sometimes called the anchorite stage. And these are individuals who pursue this life. This begins in the early 4th century. Their idea was to be in isolation, to have a strict diet, and sometimes torture themselves. Some of the individuals of note are, first of all, Saint Anthony of Egypt. He lived from 250 to 356. If you go to Egypt, you will come across a great reverence for Saint Anthony. He's the founder of the hermit life to the Eastern Church. He retired from public life at the ripe old age of 20, and lived a life of meditation for the rest of his life in a cave in Egypt. Sound appealing to anybody?
Didn't know they had caves in Egypt.
Yeah, I was just thinking, where do you find a cave in Egypt?
That was below
no.
sea level.
Actually, well, mostly when we see pictures of Egypt, we see pictures right along the Nile River. Once you get beyond the Nile, it's desert and mountains. There are mountains there. So you found a cave in one of those mountains. All right, next is a guy that Brian mentioned a week or so ago, Saint Simeon Stylites. At 13, he heard the Beatitudes, and that set him off to look to be a hermit. He ate once a week on Sunday, and he fasted for 46 days of Lent. He had to be one skinny dude. He also bound himself in wet cords and chains. After having lived buried up to his neck in the ground for several months, he decided to achieve holiness by becoming a pole sitter, spending 30 years upon the top of a 60-foot pillar near Antioch.
Like
There's-
a circus show.
Yeah, and this is a drawing of him on top of his pillar. You can see, I don't have down here how big the pillar was. You remember, you
It's about a meter square,
a meter square,
about a yardstick square.
all right? And here's another drawing of him. I mean, there's so many questions that come to my mind concerning spending 30 years on top of a pillar, but there are no answers to my questions, so I'll just not state them.
It's interesting, his, obviously where it was, became a church or a holy place or whatever. And the Russians actually bombed it. It's in Syria.
Yeah,
The Russians destroyed the place when they bombed Syria and all this stuff, but a few years ago.
on purpose?
I have no idea. But when I was reading just information about it,
Yeah.
you know, and that was one of the things that came up, as they destroyed they bombed it.
Wow.
Oops.
Think about, what's going on now, that's what stuck in my head.
Yeah, interesting. Next, a guy named Bosky. He lived in the fields eating grass. That was his contribution to the world. Then there was Amun, who never undressed and never took a bath. So it's a good thing he was a hermit.
Right.
If he wasn't a hermit, if he came into someplace, he soon was. Yeah. And there was another guy, don't know his name, who wandered naked in the vicinity of Mount Sinai for 50 years. So if you visited Mount Sinai, you might see this guy streaking across the countryside. All right, that's the hermit stage. A little bit on the crazy side. Not everybody was crazy. There were guys that were just living by themselves. I think of St. Jerome, who lived in a cave also near Bethlehem. And although he wasn't there his entire life, but and he was perfectly sane, translated the Bible into the common language of the time, which is Latin, wrote commentaries, had an exchange of letters with guys like Augustine and others. He was a perfectly sane person and committed to biblical orthodoxy. All right.
Probably had cable.
Probably had cable.
Yeah, it was a man
In his cave.
Yeah, it was a man cave.
His man cave.
That's right.
He had a lion there too, apparently. All right, next we come to the organized stage. This is when they start gathering together. This is interesting too. And we separated east and west. In the east, there was a guy named Pachomius. You see his dates. And he was a hermit who decided, hey, wouldn't it be all better if we got together? So he gathered, and it's amazing to me that there are this many out there. He gathered together 7,000 monks to live on an island in the Nile River. This was in the year 320. So here's a map of the Nile. You can see there's a place dedicated to St. Anthony. Trying to find a place. I don't remember where it is now. But you can see a lot of monasteries and stuff all along the Nile River. A couple interesting things about these 7,000 monks that are all together on this island in the Nile. First of all, they all slept on stone. And they lived in absolute silence. So no crying out warnings about the crocodile sneaking up on the guy sleeping there. You know, it was silence. Wizard of Id, what was that? I think Friar Gorman just broke his vow of silence. Golf would do it. All right, that's Pachomius. Now in the West, there was a guy by the name of Benedict of Nursia. He was born into a noble family in northern Italy. He traveled to Rome at the age of 20 to study, but he was shocked by the vices of Rome, and so he decided to go off and live as a hermit. He doesn't seem to have left Rome for the purpose of becoming a hermit, but only to find someplace away from the life of the great city. He took his old nurse with him as a servant, and they settled down to live somewhere east of Rome in a cave. The cave has a large triangular shaped opening and is about 10 feet deep. On his way from there, he met a monk whose monastery was on the mountain above the cliff overhanging the cave. His name was Romanus. Romanus had discussed with Benedict the purpose which had brought him to that place and had given him the monk's habit, the clothing. By his advice, Benedict became a hermit, and for 3 years, unknown to men, lived in this cave above the lake. One day, according to the story, the devil brought before his imagination a beautiful woman he had formerly known, inflaming his heart with strong desire for her. Immediately, Benedict stripped off his clothes and rolled into a thorn bush until his body was lacerated. Thus, through the wounds of the body, he cured the wounds of his soul. He organized a cloister in 529 at Monte Cassino, which is the oldest Western cloister. He wrote what's called the Rule of Saint Benedict, which he hoped would act as a school of the Lord's service, an institution of which we hope we are going to establish nothing harsh, nothing burdensome. So he had come up with some rules that he thought that a cloister should follow. He has 73 short chapters which comprise the rule. Its wisdom is of two kinds: spiritual, how to live a Christocentric life on earth, and administrative, how to run a monastery efficiently. More than half the chapters describe how to be obedient and humble and what to do when a member of the community is not. About a fourth of the chapters regulate the work of God. 1/10 outline how and by whom the monastery should be managed. Following the golden rule, pray and work, the monks each day devoted 8 hours to prayer, 8 hours to sleep, and 8 hours to manual work, sacred reading, or works of charity. An important aspect of their work was to be hospitable to travelers. He said, "Let all guests that happen to come be received as Christ." And that was something that carried on through hundreds of years in the monasteries. If you ever needed a place to stay, you could go stop by a monastery. In the Rule of Benedict was established what became known as the Benedictine vow, which became universal by the 8th century. The vow was a solemn promise that candidates for reception into a Benedictine community were required to make. Originally, it was a promise of stability, to remain in the same community. Secondly, it was the idea that they were to live in this place as a monk in obedience to its rule and abbot. Thirdly, to live in obedience to the community superior, seen as holding the place of Christ within it. These vows eventually evolved to, in the 12th century, what is called the Benedictine vow, which was promoted by Francis of Assisi and his followers. So even though this wasn't necessarily his vow, it kind of condensed to this. So the Benedictine vow, beginning in the 12th century, consisted of chastity, so no sexual relations, obedience, particularly to the person in charge, and poverty. All right, any questions about the monasteries? Yes.
Point B on our outline there, conversatio morum, an idiomatic Latin phrase suggesting blank is blank.
Okay, I remember I skipped over that because I didn't think I had that in your notes.
Okay.
Let's see, I gotta find. That is. No. Okay, read part of what's before that.
Conversatio morum, an idiomatic Latin phrase
there it is.
suggesting.
Conversion of manners.
Okay.
Conversion of manners. Conversatio morum, conversion of manners.
Let's see, what's the next one?
Obedience to the community superior. And so his 3 points were similar to what eventually became the Benedictine vow, but summarized by Francis of Assisi as chastity, obedience, and poverty. Okay, any other questions? Anything else I skipped?
Every once in a while, I listen to the Catholic radio station.
We've been wondering about you.
It's great to do. I mean, you really learn things.
Mhm.
They're all the time talking about Benedictine monks.
Mhm.
I mean, it's still
Highly respected.
exactly. It's still very, after all these years or whatever.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Not growing up Catholic, what do they do?
Um,
I mean, it's not like there's a church where people go and, they have like pastors or, priests or something like that. What do they do? in
well, they
monasteries?
are priests in a
So
sense.
do people actually go there and they,
Some monasteries, people can go there for mass, but they do celebrate mass every day. And all the monks participate in that, so that's part of it. They spend a lot of the day in prayer and study. If depending on what where they are and what their purpose is. Especially in the medieval period, you find a lot of them involved in agriculture. And so it's the monks and monasteries that come up with things like crop rotation and managing animals and plants to develop, better strains and all that. So because they don't have families to take care of, they put a lot more time into those things. So they're working manual work, prayer, gathering together to sing hymns, go to mass.
Yeah, but it's not like it's a church though, right? I mean, like I've done work out at Villa Maria and, I see people going in there and stuff, but I don't understand who supports it, like, is it contributions from people? And like,
Okay.
I don't understand, I can't comprehend the purpose of it as far as like the people,
Yeah, I can't address how every monastery is supported, but many of them are self-supporting. For example, what they produce, a lot of monasteries are known for their wine. In Germany, we went to a monastery that was famous for the beer they produced, different, I can't think of the word, different grains, some would, wheat or hops or, whatever, and they did different flavors. And so, I think many of them are self-supporting that way. Now, in the United States, maybe not so much, I don't know.
So they're basically like religious communes where
Yeah.
they just go and live together and,
Uh-huh.
It's just for them.
Right.
Pretty much.
Yep. Yeah, good questions. I don't have all the answer, but I know something about it. Hopefully enough
Because
to,
I know Villa Maria's, they're into farming too. They have like an actual working farm out there
Okay.
and stuff, it's.
and so a lot of times that's self-supporting too. They grow their own crops,
That
whatever.
was their original plan, was to
Yeah.
have the farm to support, and then they started
Yeah.
the community for old people.
Yeah.
And built that, and then the convention center type
Mhm.
people come together. That's why I caught when you said they welcomed all visitors,
Yeah.
that was always, Villa Maria.
When you think about monasteries, back at the beginning or in the Middle Ages, whatever, their original intention was to grow food for themselves, but they got so good at it that they grew more food than they needed, so they could sell it and get
The
money
big
that way.
problem is they all get too old. Nobody comes and joins them.
Today,
Well, today, pretty
Yeah.
much, I don't know about back.
yeah, back in the
In
middle,
480,
as
I
we'll get
was
into
around
medieval
quite
times
early.
and so on, there was no shortage, it seems. In part because it's getting a lot ahead of ourselves, but in medieval times, quite often, it's only the older son that would receive the inheritance of all the lands of his father. That means the other sons had to find something else to do. And for many, the only thing left was to be part of the church.
It's the Harmony Village. That was a monastery, but it was that same thing, separate out.
Yeah, the problem with them is they couldn't attract, at Economy Village, they couldn't attract
Very
more
obvious
people
reasons,
because there was no marriage and
Yeah.
all the rest, but because they didn't have the religious foundation. Whereas the Roman Catholic Church had a religious reason for joining the monastery for the reasons that I cited above. All right, now we'll look at something about the Benedictine monks, most common during medieval times. And there's the vow of obedience, chastity, and poverty. Here are the different cloisters, the different orders, I should say, of monks that came into existence during the medieval period. This is ahead of our time frame now, but just to give you a glance ahead, there's the Benedictines, and you can see the founder in Ephesus. There will come a time where there will be an order called the Cistercians, the Cluny monks, and then what you're more familiar with, possibly the Dominicans, which are one of the begging orders. So that's how they got their money, was begging. They took vows of poverty, stressed the importance of preaching, missions, and theological training. So it's the Dominicans that really become the mission monks. They're the ones that go throughout the world spreading Roman Catholicism. And then the Franciscans, named after Francis of Assisi, they're also a begging order. They renounce worldly goods and they are committed to theological training. So they're more the educators, the Franciscans. But both of them are supported by begging. One's not on here is a later order, the Augustinian monks. They've become important because that's what Martin Luther was, as well as some others that got involved in the Reformation. Thought I'd show you some pictures of some monasteries in Greece to show their commitment to get away. I don't, can you see that building up there on the right and then up on the left on top of that, those mountains? Those are monasteries. When you build on top of a mountain like that, there are no roads. They literally somebody had to climb up there and then with a rope pull up all the supplies needed to build that building, as well as any people that wanted to come up, pull them up in a basket and then let them down. Amazing place. Now, there are some that have roads today. We're able to go into one. But look how isolated that is on top of that mountain. Do you see it there right in the middle? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Beautiful area, beautiful mountains. That's in one of the monasteries on a Byzantine monastery. So Eastern Church, Greek Orthodox Church. That's also part of that monastery. Beautiful buildings. There's another one on top of the mountain. Yeah, I wouldn't want to be on that rope. And even today, like there's no way to get there. I guess, except by road, because there's obviously no road going up to that. That's taken from the other monastery. All right, let's evaluate monasticism. First of all, as I mentioned, though, the agricultural benefits to Europe as they developed a lot of things related to farming. Another strength was, besides farming, I should also say they built roads, they cleared land, they developed livestock, farming techniques, and so on. They also kept scholarship alive at a time when there were not really universities per se, and people were largely illiterate, especially in Europe. They kept copying books and they kept reading and studying books. And so scholarship continued in the monasteries. Thirdly, they became missionary and training centers. So if you wanted to become a missionary, you went to a monastery. When we talk about early missions, well, one of the guys we'll talk about is St. Patrick. I think I may have talked with you about him before, maybe on St. Patrick's Day or close to that. But once he became a believer, he went to a monastery to be trained and eventually became a missionary to Ireland. That was the normal procedure. The next one is that they provided places of hospitality for the needy. So not only travelers, but if you live near a monastery and you just had a tough time, you could go there for help. Any questions or comments about the strengths? Okay, the weaknesses. First of all, it drained many of the best men from leadership of Europe. So again, we're talking about getting into the Middle Ages here. That like I said, the oldest son often was the only one who got anything, and other of the sons of a family may have become great leaders, may have done a good job at helping to run areas, countries, whatever, but instead they were in a monastery somewhere. Secondly, it gave a double standard of morality with their high view of celibacy and low view of marriage. So on the one hand, marriage is one of the sacraments of the church, and yet the idea of being a monk in a monastery and being celibate was elevated above everything else. The third weakness is that it aided in the pandering to spiritual pride. You know, if you've got a class of people that are considered more spiritual than everybody else because of what they're doing or where they live, then that tends to put everybody else on a lower level. And so it was already bad, getting bad enough in the church with the idea of the clergy and laity. Well, now you've got people that are even, in a sense, more spiritual than the clergy because they're off living by themselves. And fourthly, it aided in the development of hierarchicalism in the church. The idea that there are levels of spirituality, levels of authority throughout the church. And the last weakness is its connection with the church. There's a correlation between the monasteries and the church. In other words, when the monasteries declined, as all of them did at one point or another, they all declined into not only spiritual pride, but wealth. And we talked about how they could support themselves. Many of the orders became wealthy. And when that happened, they ceased to be spiritual. And when that occurred, it induced the church in the same direction. So as the monasteries went, so went the church. And so there was a constant effort to start new orders in order to, now we're going to do it right. Now we're going to be spiritual. The other orders have gone by the wayside. We're going to be the spiritual ones, which worked for a while until they also became corrupt. All right, any questions or comments about the monasteries system? I told you about the beginning of it, and it continues on to the present day. Not as influential today as they once were, certainly. Very influential in the Middle Ages in Europe. Have I convinced anybody to become a monk?
I was trying to remember science class way back when, wasn't it a monk who figured out gene things through peas?
Yes.
Do you remember that? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah,
I used to know his name.
yeah,
It's in here somewhere.
yeah. And so they,
Yeah.
I mean, they got so good at agriculture that they were making scientific discoveries
Right.
about it all.
Yeah, genetic development
Yeah, exactly.
of not only that, but animals as well.
Yeah.
And all kinds of farming techniques they came up with that made agriculture more sustainable. Anything else? All right, let's go on to another set of information. We're going to begin looking at early missions. Okay. Just go, just
shrink it down, actually.
let's shrink it
You
down.
have to share it.
Now I lost it entirely.
That's actually there.
So you gotta go to the screen share, and then it pops up. There it is.
Now, most of what we try to do is been kind of chronological from after the church. We move chronologically through different issues. And looking at missions, it's going to be looking at missions, certainly after the apostles, but as a whole, we're going to be looking at a large amount of years, kind of looking at missions in general, especially, the 3rd century and following. The background to this is that by the end of the 1st century, so many Roman soldiers had become Christians that they planted the church as far away as England. The church there became influential and wealthy but was destroyed by the influx of barbaric tribes of Angles and Saxons in the 5th century. If you look up there, you can see the Angles and the Saxons, which are Germanic, came out, invaded England. Well, it was called England later. It comes from Angle land. That's where we get England, Angle land. So Britain is what the Romans called it. And actually, the people living here that were driven out by the Angles and Saxons were Christians. And they were driven over to this area of Britain, which we now call Wales. So today's Welsh were the original Christians of Britain. At the same time, or during those centuries, barbaric tribes invaded the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire is beginning to decline, and you see have all these different groups: the Franks, Burgundians, Goths, Vandals, Visigoths, Ostrogoths. All these are putting pressure on the Roman Empire. They're invading, opening Europe for vandalism, which comes from the Vandals. The idea, vandalism, we know what that is today. Well, that comes from a group of people called the Vandals, because they would come in and destroy stuff. In fact, in 411, Visigoths sacked Rome. So let's see. And you can see most of them are coming from this area and then moving in. And the Visigoths, they come up this direction. They come down to Rome. And you can, it's hard to imagine that in 411, that the Roman Empire could have deteriorated to the extent that the city of Rome could actually be invaded and sacked by a group of barbarians. What has happened to the Roman army, to the Roman Empire? And so they do that, and then they move on over into present day Spain and Portugal and establish a kingdom there. Then they move into North Africa and attack those that are living there. Here is a painting that someone has done of the sack of Rome. Notice one of the things they're carrying out is the menorah from Jerusalem. I just thought this was kind of humorous. The Visigoth explaining himself. We wanted literature, music, arts. We were starved for these things. We didn't sack Rome, really. We were just looking for poems. I'm sorry if we broke some stuff. And here's a kingdom then of the Visigoths from a large part of what we call France today, which comes from the Franks. The Franks were Germanic, so France is the kingdom of the Franks. And you've got the Visigoths part of that area down into Spain. Here's the directions the Visigoths take. We saw it on an earlier map, starting over this area, coming down to Greece, up this way, Italy, and then on over. Yeah, whoops, wrong way. I do better when I'm doing it on here. I forget which direction I'm going. So here's another map showing the different barbarians that were coming into the Roman Empire. You see up there the Franks moving into what was called Gaul before that. You see them coming from all of the eastern and northern directions. They're putting pressure, invading the Roman Empire. And then ultimately from the south as the Visigoths go all the way around, or the Vandals go all the way around and then come up from the south as well. Now, the very interesting thing to understand here is that the barbarians essentially conquered the Roman Empire. But in the process, the church conquered the barbarians because they became Christians. Really stunning. And it's largely through some of the missionaries we're going to look at. So here's how it shakes down in the year 480, the different German kingdoms. You can see Alemanni. Alemann is what the Spanish still call Germany. So those are Germans, the Franks, Burgundians, Visigoths with a W there, Ostrogoths, Vandals, so on. Ulfilas is the first missionary we're going to look at. Now, interestingly, he's an Arian, which means what? What did Arius believe? There was,
A time when he was not,
which means what?
Jesus was not created, or was not, when he was not. He was created.
Yes, he was created. Right, Jesus was created. So somehow he's divine, but still there was a time when he was created. He was not eternal. And Ulfilas was an Arian, but he took the gospel and worked among the Visigoths. Now, the Visigoths language was not written. So as many missionaries have had to do in recent centuries, he had to first make up written letters to represent what they're saying and reduce their language to writing. A tremendous feat. And as a result of that, then he translated the Bible into their language. So first reduced their language to writing, and then he translated the Bible, and it was, I don't know if he did this on purpose to impress them, but it was called the Silver Bible because it was covered in silver. There's an example of it right there. Now, interestingly enough, he left out a couple books in his translation, not because he was an Arian, but he left out the books of Kings and Samuel because he thought that reading those would encourage them to warfare. Those books are too violent, and so he decided to leave those out. And there's a copy of a page of what's called the Gothic Bible. All right, any questions about Ulfilas? All right, next we come to Martin of Tours. Maybe you've seen one of these paintings, famous paintings of Martin. Supposedly he encountered this poor man during a very cold day in wintertime. The man was almost naked and was begging along the road. Martin was struck by the suffering of this poor man and on the spot cut his long mantle into two pieces and gave one half to the beggar to cover himself. That same night, Martin saw in his dream Jesus, now dressed in the part of the mantle which he had given to the poor man. This dream became a turning point in the life of Martin. He came to the understanding that he could meet Jesus in his needy brothers and sisters. From that time onwards, Martin dedicated his life to the poor and neglected people. He became the patron saint of France, who worked among the Burgundians. Any questions about Martin of Tours? Okay, the city of Tours is pumping out missionaries. There's another guy named Gregory of Tours. He worked among the Franks. You can see on the map there that part of France where the Franks lived. Burgundy is among it, the city of Lyon, the area of Burgundy. A part of present-day Germany, there's Mainz, Cologne, and then in the western area, there's the area of Aquitaine, which you may remember from later Eleanor of Aquitaine. So he worked among the Franks who were inhabiting a large part of the area of Gaul. And he won Clovis, king of the Franks, to Christ. And what happened, many times in these in these ancient times, towards medieval times, is whatever the king does, everybody else does. So when Clovis committed to Christ, his people all became Christians too. How many of them legitimately were Christians? That's hard to say. Here's a painting of his baptism by Gregory of Tours. Eventually, Clovis conquered other tribes, and I guess we could say forced them to become Christians. So Christianity is growing in ways maybe that we wouldn't like, but it's becoming more influential. All right, any questions about Gregory of Tours? All right, next we come to the time of Patrick of Ireland. During the reign of King Lucius, AD 179, so this is a little bit earlier than some of the other ones we've looked at, Britain formally acknowledged Jesus Christ as the Messiah, thereby becoming the first Christian nation in the world. Patrick was raised in a Christian home more than 200 years later. At about that time, John Chrysostom, remember him, Patriarch of Constantinople, he was lived from 347 to 407. He commented this: though thou shouldest go to the ocean, to the British Isles, there thou shouldest hear all men everywhere discoursing matters out of the scriptures, with another voice indeed, another language, but not another faith, with a different tongue, but the same judgment. So at that point, Chrysostom said the gospel is not only in Britain, but everybody there talks about it. Patrick was captured by Irish Druids on the coast of northern England and was made a slave. I don't know the exact location, but somewhere up in here, he was captured. This is Ireland here, so it's not very far. And Irish pirates would come over and raid the towns along the coast and would capture young men to be slaves. Oops, there's the quote. I forgot that I had it on a slide. You can read it again if you like. While watching his master's sheep, he had a vision that he would escape on a boat. He escaped as the vision indicated. He's out on the hillside with the sheep. And I can't remember how many years he was there, but he just basically walked off the job and started walking toward the coast until he came to a boat, as the vision had indicated, was able to finagle his way onto the boat. Initially, the captain didn't want him, wouldn't take him, but the crew somehow became enamored with this young man and said, oh, come on, let's take him. And so they did. It was rather a long trip. A lot of things happened that I won't go into detail here, but eventually, and having been raised a Christian, I should have mentioned this, he did not embrace the faith himself, but sitting there on the hillside with the sheep, hour after hour, he started to remember all the things he had learned. So it's important to teach children Bible verses, Psalms, because even if they don't embrace the faith now, later on, that'll come back to their minds. And so he became a Christian, eventually returned to his home, went to a monastery in France to train for the ministry. At some point, he had another vision or a dream in which an Irish person was saying to him, much like the Macedonian said to Paul, come and help us, boy. Boy, come back and help us, something like that. And so he returned to Ireland and established Orthodox Christianity there, baptizing thousands of people, ordaining clergy, setting up monasteries where the clergy was educated and the word of God was copied. So today he is the patron saint of Ireland. The Roman Catholic Church claims him, but I claim him because of what he believed and what he taught. He was an Orthodox Christian. He was not a present Roman Catholic, as you might think of Roman Catholicism. In fact, they didn't even know about Roman Catholicism in Britain at that time. That wouldn't happen until later. They were Orthodox Christians that were in Britain, that were established, as I said, by soldiers. Roman soldiers were there. There's also tradition that Joseph of Arimathea went to Britain and brought the gospel as well. Many conflicts with the Druids there. I highly commend to you. There are some good movies on YouTube that go through his life, and some books written of him. In fact, some things he wrote are still available. You can find them, and it's interesting reading. This is the Mountain of St. Patrick in Ireland. And this is called the Shield of St. Patrick. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but there's a part of it that I think that captures most of what it says here. And that is this: Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. There's a man who is committed to Christ. Something we all should aspire to. So if you want to look this up, it's St. Patrick's breastplate. It became a prayer that was used. All right, any questions about St. Patrick? There's a lot more about him, but if you have questions, I'll see if I can answer. So he's really not Irish, he's British, but was a missionary to Ireland. I'll point out one more thing. The tradition is he drove the snakes out of Ireland. Well, Ireland was an island, there were no snakes. But I think that, and that was the explanation why there are any snakes in Ireland. Oh, St. Patrick drove them out. And that's just a myth. Yeah. I think there's some truth to it, because the snakes he drove out were not physical snakes, they were spiritual snakes. Because the Irish people came to know Christ and got rid of Druidism.
What's number 3? Escape as a vision indicated, trained in the blank in France.
Monastery. Trained in a monastery. Any question about Patrick? Okay, there may be more to say about the next guy, Columba, than we have time to do. Now, before we do that, are we going to have class next week?
Yeah.
All right, so this is our last class then, right? Because after that,
Oh, that's right.
there's no more.
The next one is the words name. I forgot about.
Yeah. All right. So if you want to find out about Columba and Iden and Boniface and Anskar, and then what brought about the collapse of the Roman Empire, you'll have to arrange a private time of instruction from me or look it up.
So we gotta wait all summer long to get back in.
All right, well then, coming back next fall, there are 2 directions we can go. I could finish the collapse of the Roman Empire because there, as you probably heard, a lot of parallels between the Roman Empire and the United States. And I think it's very interesting. So we could do that and then go on into medieval times to understand, what happened to the church, to eventually the Roman Catholic Church would embrace all the doctrines that they do today. What brought that about? What ended up bringing in the Reformation? So that could be discussion, or we can leave history for a while and do what I had suggested another time, and that is study the life of Christ with all the Gospels put together. That would mean we'll have to see whether that would entail you doing work in between, or whether we just do it all together on Sunday. We can do it that way. But it would be a pretty in-depth look at the life of Christ, putting all the Gospels together. I've developed a curriculum that does that. And so we could do that as well. So think about it for a moment, and we'll entertain maybe what it is that you would like to do next week. Let's go ahead and shut this off, so that discussion is not on YouTube, in case people start yelling at me.